Hey guys, so we're gonna get ready for your test coming up, and we are talking about the Iberian Peninsula Age of Expansion, or otherwise known as the Age of Exploration. We're gonna be talking about how Spain and Portugal changed the world by their oceanic expeditions to the New World, and how other civilizations prior to them kind of helped. So go ahead and make sure you have your PowerPoints ready and your notes ready. We're just gonna run this through pretty quickly. Prior to the Iberian Peninsula getting involved in the Age of Exploration, other civilizations were out there exploring the Indian Ocean prior to 1450. Arab traders had studied the monsoon seasons long before the Europeans ever got involved, and that allowed them to establish longer trading routes between places like India and the eastern coast of Africa. So it allowed them to go and start beginning the early beginnings of the trade of what we now call Asian luxury goods. These are things like silk, porcelain, ivory, and other precious metals that were very popular among the Asian and Middle Eastern markets and were slowly becoming important in the European market. Well, how did it get so popular in the European market? Well, that's thanks to a guy named Marco Polo. We talked about Marco Polo. He was from Venice in Italy, and we know that he established the Silk Road in the 1200s. This would be a land-made road that would essentially go from Italy all the way to China. Now, that was the original means of getting a lot of these Asian luxury items all the way from the Middle East and in Asia back over into Europe. So the Muslim traders, the Asian markets, as well as the Italian merchants had complete control over most of the fine goods that were coming out of these areas. Now, the Chinese were heavily involved in the Age of Exploration as well, though their governmental system was much different than that of what we saw in Europe. While Spain and Portugal's kings and queens were, I don't want to say weak, but they weren't the strongest in terms of structural governments, China's was a much more efficient system of government. And in fact, China had a very high level of means of production for most of their goods that they created in society. So they felt that overseas exploration was more of a luxury than a necessity. So they were kind of okay with limiting and downright getting rid of their overseas expeditions. These expeditions were very important. People like Zhang He would go off and find vast new places of wealth, such as the Spice Islands of Indonesia and all throughout the coastline of India, using these large lateen sails upon his ships. These Chinese vessels were known as junk ships at the time, and they were able to go and begin the early levels of great seafaring expeditions. So large-scale seafaring expeditions, more than just a few miles here and there at a time. So what did the Europeans learn from these expeditions prior to the 1450s throughout the Middle East and in Asia? Well, several big pieces of technology came through here. The Muslim traders invented the astrolabe, a tool that's used to help triangulate the angle to which you are navigating from the horizon to a particular star in the sky to help navigate. We saw that the Malay people would do the Moana hand thing there and allow them to do the similar things. We saw that the Chinese invented the magnetic compass, allowing them to be more direct and exact with their measurements. And also the lateen sails seen on those Chinese junk ships were very important and crucial for the Europeans to begin amassing the technology needed to tackle large sail oceanic expeditions. So what was it that the Europeans were after? What was it that the Iberian Peninsula states were trying to find when they went off on these expeditions? Well, we learned the three G's a while back. We should remember God, gold, glory. Those three main elements were the pushing factor that got the Spanish and Portuguese to take these extraordinarily expensive and dangerous risks to find a new pathway to the Asian luxury market on the other side of the world. But how are they going to get there? And that was the difficult task at hand. Well, when we say gold, we don't necessarily mean that the precious metal gold, right? In fact, silver was a much more popular option in terms of most currencies around the world. China heavily was influenced by the access to silver, being that China for a long time was dependent upon Japan for its silver production. But when the Tokugawa shogunate took over Japan, it limited their access to silver. So any more silver they could find would be for their betterment. So Europe was really on the hunt for silver. Now, when we say gold, we are talking about, of course, these luxury items that they were looking for, whether it be gold, silver, porcelain, precious stones like jade and diamonds. We could also be talking about things like silk and other fine luxury goods that they just really didn't have. Most spices were most commonly not found in much of Europe, and eventually tobacco would be a major crop that would be very popular among the Europeans at the time. So when we talk about gold, we're not necessarily talking about just gold, but more what we're talking about precious items that they could sell for a lot of money. Now, when we talk about glory, we need to make sure we understand the fact that most of the time during this time period, if you were born poor, you were going to die poor. And if you were born rich, unless you made a lot of mistakes, you were probably going to die rich. So that mobility from being poor to being wealthy was very rare at the time. So this gave people the opportunity, while these weak rulers of Portugal and Spain may not have been able to go off and venture these places, as long as you had the courage, the bravery, and the financial backing, you could go and make something of yourself and go and conquer these new territories and these lands that have yet to be discovered. So finally, we get to God. So we know that much of the European continent was Christian. But at this time, this is the golden age of the Islamic Renaissance. We'll learn about the three big Islamic caliphates that existed in the world at this time. But Islam was spreading like wildfire at this point, and Europe was getting a little nervous. Specifically the Spanish, with their invasion of parts of their territory by the Moors, a Islamic group that would eventually make their homeland in Spain. The push for spreading Christianity became very popular at this time. So while financial means and the prestige of going off and exploring these new territories was important, the push to spread Christianity as a way to slow down the Muslim invasion into much of Europe was seen as a necessity, specifically by the Pope. So we would see that these three G's were the primary motivator to get Spain and Portugal off the couch and go. So to get them started, Portugal was really the first of the Iberian states to get their foot into the age of exploration. And that was all thanks to the man by the name of Prince Henry the Navigator, would be his nickname. Now, he would establish a school for oceanic seafarers to come to learn the latest and greatest of the technology needed at the time. Think of him as the Captain America or Tony Stark of the Avengers, right? The leader that would by himself not be able to save the world, but eventually, by getting everyone else put around them, they could get the necessary push needed to get over the hump and find a way to access those Asian luxury good markets without going through the Muslim and Italian-controlled Mediterranean route that had long been previously established. So what was it that Henry the Navigator did? Well, he introduced people to the technologies of the time, whether that be the astrolabe, the compass, lateen sails, or the caravel. Remember, a caravel is a type of ship that was most commonly seen during this period. It was very large and powerful, yet very maneuverable to get into the shallower areas near coastlines, thus making it a very, very important ship, especially when going through the Atlantic Ocean. As we learned earlier, remember, the Pacific Ocean really was a very peaceful ocean to navigate through. Fairly simple. The Atlantic, on the other hand, not so much. Much more rough and dangerous and more difficult to navigate. So creating a powerful yet maneuverable ship, which had the ability to use lateen sails to push even during seas, even against the wind, would be very necessary at this time. So when Henry the Navigator opened the school, the idea was he was going to inspire the next generation of oceanic seafarers. And we start off with people like Fernand Gomes. Now, Fernand Gomes was able to take Portugal and establish bases and ports of call along the western coast of Africa. This is the first step to getting to the other side of the world, because much like what Henry the Navigator thought, many of the Portuguese at the time realized maybe we can sail underneath Africa and make our way over into India. But in order to do that, they would have to find a way to get to the southern tip of Africa. While Fernand Gomes was first in getting them along the western coastline and establishing the ports needed, it would be a man by the name of Bartolomé Diaz who would be the first to make it to the southern tip of Africa. This is a win. This proves that the idea that we could sail to India by going underneath Africa was possible. All we needed was a little bit of a push. and that would be Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama makes history by being the first man to sail from Portugal all the way underneath the southern tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean, over all the way to India to make it to the Indian Asian luxury goods market. He established the dream that was started up by Prince Henry the Navigator 60 years prior to. Vasco da Gama opens the door to the Portuguese Empire from starting. Now remember, their goal was to colonize more than just little trade markets. They wanted to establish a financial foothold into the world, and these wealthier, established explorers now are going to want to do this. So by establishing themselves a foothold in the Asian luxury market, they would go on to establish colonies along the western coast of India, as well as into the Spice Islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. So Portugal is already on their way into the ascendancy of the age of exploration. But don't forget about its Iberian brother, Spain. They're going to get a little jelly bellies, and they're going to want to get involved in the age of exploration as well. Now, like we had said, Spain and Portugal, they were kind of like brotherly rivals. And seeing Portugal with all this success, whether it be Ferdinand Gomes or Prince Henry the Navigator or Vasco da Gama, don't forget Bartolomé Diaz and his adorable little hat. But they were able to make it all the way to that Asian luxury market, and Spain didn't want to get left in the dust. They just had to find the man with the right plan. Now, at the time, there wasn't really a Spaniard who was up for the mission, but there was this Italian guy by the name of Cristobal Colombo. Otherwise, we in English would call him Christopher Columbus. He would go to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain and say, hey, look, guys, I bet if we sail west, we can make it all the way east again to that Asian luxury market. I will sail around the world and get you there. And they said, bet, we'll take it. And so he does. His 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, would set sail in 1492, and they would arrive in India. Not quite. They arrived in the Bahamas, but still, he thought he had made it to India. In fact, Columbus would make this trip 4 more times in his lifetime, thinking he made it all the way to India. Now, unfortunately, the interactions with the natives wasn't great. His first interactions with the Arawak peoples of the Bahamas didn't go so well. And in fact, we now know that disease was the main culprit in the deaths of anywhere between 50 to 90% of the populations on many of these islands. Slavery was an issue during this time as well, and Columbus was very resistant upon the notion that he had not made it to the other side of the planet. He was convinced he had made it to India. Now, it wouldn't be Columbus. In fact, it wouldn't even be in his lifetime they realized that he was wrong. It would be a man by the name of Amerigo Vespucci that realized that Columbus didn't actually make it to Asia, but he discovered 2 entirely new continents, the Americas, which would be named after him, of course, Amerigo Vespucci, and this would open the doors to a massive new discovery of goods and services known as the Columbian Exchange. Now, we should remember the Columbian Exchange because we did this a while ago back in geography. But the Columbian Exchange was the trading of goods from the New World to the Old World and the Old World to the New World. So remember, things like horses and pigs and cattle were not indigenous to the New World, aka South America and North America. Those had to be brought over from Europe. But things like turkey, tobacco, cotton, well, not really cotton, they had that in the Old World, but still, things like sugar and other goods like that were not found in the Old World. Tomatoes, potatoes, all these delicious, wonderful treats, corn, was not located in the Old World. It had to be brought over from the New World. So the Columbian Exchange also had some unfortunate consequences. We now know that diseases like smallpox and influenza made their way from the Old World to the New World, thus killing large droves of the populations of the time. But other illnesses like syphilis, unfortunately, made their way from the New World to the Old World as well. We would see that the Columbian Exchange both had positive and negative consequences for the world, but it was definitely something important that without Columbus and without the Spanish, we wouldn't have gotten to. So now that Portugal and Spain has had a new foothold on the world, they're gonna have to come to some type of arrangement as to who gets to claim what. The world was starting to shrink at this point, and lots of land and territory were being taken up. So if we think back to who is the most powerful person in Europe at the time, we would know that that would be the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. Remember, Europe, a predominantly Christian nation, Europe, a predominantly Christian continent, was controlled and under the influence of the Catholic Church at this time. We haven't made it to the Reformation yet, and we haven't made it to the Protestant arrivals yet. So really, the Pope had a massive amount of power over the world, and this is where the Treaty of Tordesillas was put into place. So what was the Treaty of Tordesillas? Well, the Treaty of Tordesillas was put into place as a means to divide the lands that was conquered by both the Spanish and the Portuguese and draw some lines throughout the world to determine what land could belong to which nation, and this was helped devised by the Pope. This allowed Spain and Portugal to not really interfere with one another and get in each other's way, thus starting a war between the Iberian states. That would have not been good. So remember, when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, so this was long after Columbus had already established a foothold into the Bahamas and the rest of the parts of the Americas, the conquistadors would arrive and they would start to conquer these particular territories. Now, as we'll talk about later when we get to the Aztecs, the Incans, and the Mayans, we know that the two particular groups of conquistadors were known for conquering the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. Now, the Aztec Empire was conquered by Hernan Cortez and were able to take over the capital city of Tenochtitlan. It didn't take that many men to actually conquer the territory, roughly about 180 men and 2 cannons. But why was it so simple? Well, yes, they had a definite dominant force when it came to their military power. It was disease. And the same with the Inca Empire that was conquered by Francisco Pizarro. Disease played a massive role. Smallpox wiped out large chunks of populations all throughout the world. As we recall, when we think back to the way that these Native Americans had arrived into this region through the land bridge 10,000 years prior to, they've been landlocked from the rest of the world. They did not have the ability to fight off the illnesses and diseases that Europeans had been exposed to for centuries. They just did not have the ability and the immunity to take on these very deadly diseases that to this day, thank goodness, through vaccinations and otherwise, have been wiped off this earth. So what is the most important thing that we need to know going into our test? Well, the Spanish and the Portuguese and the other European states, their reasoning for going into the age of exploration was quite simple. The 3 Gs: God, gold, and glory. And I know you must be thinking, well, why wasn't China or the Middle East getting involved this much? Different civilizations, different needs. The Chinese was ran by a large civil service system that was very intricate and detailed with a lot of power. And they had the ability to maintain and grow enough crops and have access to all the luxury goods that the Europeans wanted without much exploration. They felt it was kind of expensive and not really needed and a bit of a waste of time. The Middle East was in a similar situation. Their societies were built on survival of need, and they already had that previously established access to these trading goods. It was Europe that had the initial response to try to promote Christendom around the world and go off and find new access to revenue and fortune. And with the European leadership being as weak as it was, and allowing for people within a new emergent merchant class to go and establish power for themselves, there was a financial motivator that pushed many of the Europeans into the age of exploration. So why do we stop with the Spanish and the Portuguese? Where's England? Where's France? Where's Germany? Well, a lot of these are sleeping giants. Europe is a little bit going through a bit of a reawakening from the dark ages of the bubonic plague. And England's going through some baby mama drama, really. Henry VIII, we'll talk about them in a minute. They're about to go through the Reformation. Germany is going through a whole lot of issues that they're going to have to solve. And France is in the same boat. But don't worry, they'll get involved and they will take what the Iberian states did and take it to that next level with a different system known as mercantilism. We'll talk about mercantilism later. But hopefully this helps. This is just part 1 of the review for you guys' test. We'll do Aztecs, Incans, and Mayans in a different video. So I hope this helps.
Me.